Hi, I'm Suze Shaner with Sage Leadership Strategies, and I'm your host today of Community Forum. And I have the great pleasure to have with me Dr. Patrick Byrne, who is a professor of philosophy at Boston College. And he's here to talk about his career as well as the Pulse program that he founded and has led for, hope I'm accurate in this, Pat, you'll correct me. I think it's almost 50 years at this point. So welcome, Pat.
Hi, Suze. It's great to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Oh,
Technically speaking, I've not been the leader of the Pulse program for 50 years, but I have been teaching in it and involved in it in various ways for 50 years. So that's right, yes.
okay. Well, thank you for clarifying that. And thank you so much for coming on the show. And I know that you went to BC undergrad, and I think you got your master's there, and then went to Stony Brook for your doctorate. So I'm wondering if you can give our viewers an overview of your early career, your background, and kind of how you came to doing the work before we get into talking specifically about the PROS program.
Okay, sure. I went to a very good high school in upstate New York, and I came out of that school with an ambition to become an elementary particle physicist. So when I came to college, Boston College, I came with three passions. One was a passion for science, one was a passion for religious faith, and the third was a passion for what we now call social justice, although to be quite honest, that was not a phrase that was in circulation at the time I came to college.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So you tripped me up on the very first phrase. What is particle? I'm not a scientist. So what is elemental particle physics?
So it's the study of how elementary particles change and transform into one another, how things like neutrons decay, but also eventually it has led into the study of quarks and hadrons and gluons and gravitons and things like that. So that was my ambition. That's what I wanted to be. In fact, I was modest enough to want to be a Nobel Prize winner in elementary particle physics.
Wow, that's quite an ambition. And so you must have obviously taken physics in high school. So you had some foundation there. Okay.
I did. So I had really wonderful teachers in high school. They were very dedicated. They really worked with us. But one of the most transformative things happened to me when I was a senior in high school. I didn't really care much for humanities. I was an all science all the time, a math science guy all the time. And I had a remarkable teacher. Her name was Rosemary Laster, and she taught the senior advanced placement English course. And I only took that course for one reason. That was so I didn't have to take English when I was in college. And she was a transformative teacher. After I finished the course with her, I wanted to go someplace where I could study physics, but I could also study humanities. And her influence was just a very powerful thing. She made literature and thinking about humanities come alive for me in ways that they never had before.
Wow.
So that's why I ended up at Boston College as opposed to a more technical university. I also had ambition I also applied to MIT, and I was accepted at both places, but I chose Boston College primarily because of Rosemary Laster's influence on me.
Wow.
And when I got to Boston College, I was now interested in studying humanities. We had to take philosophy every 4 years that we were students there at that time. I had what I now look back on as one of the worst teachers I ever had was my introductory philosophy teacher.
It didn't deter you because you ended up majoring in it. So yeah, what happened there?
Well, we studied Plato, we studied Aristotle, we studied Aquinas, we studied Locke, we studied Hume, and it just blew my mind. I just fell in love with philosophy, and I didn't even know that my teacher was that bad until years later. But I just was so captivated with the way they thought about these things, and it just drew me in. And so
And what was bad about your teacher, though?
He came to class unprepared. He was boring. He never said anything that was not already in the books, that didn't really bring it alive.
Okay. But you were so enthralled by the books themselves.
Enthralled by what we were reading, yeah.
Okay.
And what happened is, in my study of philosophy, I discovered this is a way that I could put together three things that really didn't fit together in any significant way, at least at the time I was an undergraduate student. it gave me ways of thinking about the connections between natural science and social justice and religious faith. Um, my religious faith came alive for me when I was about 16 years old, and it was a big transformation of going from religion as following rules and commandments to promoting justice and compassion. It just was a very transformative moment in my life, and so for me, religious faith was not something that was a matter of just following rules, but rather something that was a vitalizing influence in my life. And so the passion for social justice actually came from my family. My mother and her parents, my grandparents, came to the United States from Germany in 1923. My mother was a year old when they came to the United States. And later on, at the outbreak of the Second World War, my grandfather was involved in helping Jewish refugees come into the United States. I didn't really know that formally until some years later, but it had an influence. It kind of like something we absorbed from being around it. So my German grandparents had Jewish friends. Our family doctor was in fact a Jewish man who my grandfather had sponsored so that he could get off the refugee boat in New York City and travel up to our city where I grew up. So that was part of the influence. My father also was he came from a kind of a tough childhood, and there were Jewish people in his life. We're Roman Catholics. I'm Irish Catholic. But we were surrounded in my upbringing with Jewish people, and became exposed to the kind of injustices and discriminations and violence that Jewish people were exposed to. And also my father told me a story, told myself and my two brothers this story. He was a great Irish raconteur, and he was always telling stories. So he was in the Marine Corps during the Second World War. And he told us the story about being on the streets of El Centro, California, and seeing an African-American naval officer and his wife standing on the street outside a drinking establishment, looking pretty forlorn. And he went up to them and talked to them. And to make a long story short, they had been denied service at this establishment. And my father was outraged, and he went in and he insisted that they be allowed to drink there. And the bartender told him, "Sorry, we don't serve, and I will say Black people here." And my father insisted, and they didn't relent. So my father bought a round of drinks for himself and these two people, and they stood out on the streets in El Centro, California, in 100-degree heat, and drank and talked, and that really has stuck with me for a long time. So when I got to college, there were three things I wanted to do to become more deeply involved with the study of science, learning more about my religious faith, because I had gone to a public high school. I didn't really know much about it, and also social justice. And while I was an undergraduate, I became involved in tutoring in the schools in the city of Boston. The schools in the city of Boston were racially segregated, heavily segregated, almost vehemently segregated. And so I was involved in tutoring programs, and then later on college preparation programs for African American and poor white students who didn't have much opportunity to go to college. And then later on, I became involved in a housing rights action program where we would visit tenants whose heat was not on, whose locks were not secured, things of that sort, to bring some kind of redress to their situations on the part of the apartment owners. So those were some of the things that led me into the Pulse program, the background that led me into the Pulse program.
And how did you, at what point did you decide that you were not going to pursue the physics route, but you were going to pursue the philosophy route?
It was probably about the end of my second year of college. I could see that what was really alive and exciting for me in my studies was was in philosophy. I did actually graduate with the physics degree, so I finished the degree itself, but I then picked up a second major in philosophy, and then went on to write a master's thesis in philosophy, take graduate courses in philosophy, and then went on to study philosophy at Stony Brook University.
So at what point, and then you came after that to teach at BC. And so at what point did you decide that you were going to be a college professor and dedicate your career to teaching and also promoting social justice?
Well, I knew that I wanted to be a teacher at a very early age. I was probably about 12 years old. My sixth grade teacher inspired me to be a teacher. And then I had, as I said, great teachers in high school, and especially Mrs. Laster. And so I always knew I wanted to be a teacher. I pretty soon figured out I wanted to be a teacher at the college level. I thought initially I was going to be a physics teacher. That was my ambition. But then as I became more drawn into philosophy, my plans shifted to becoming a professor of philosophy instead. But the teaching in social justice actually started before I went off to do my doctoral studies. Upon graduation from Boston College, I had the opportunity to start what now became the Pulse program. I got a call from the president of the Boston College undergraduate government, who was interested in starting what he called an internship program. He was a political science major. He had ambitions to go on into politics, and he did spend part of his early career involved in Massachusetts state politics. And he was looking for an opportunity to get exposed to people in the State House of Massachusetts, and he thought this kind of internship program would be a good idea. But he also,
so how did you shape it? Because the focus really is, as we know, well, our viewers will learn, faith, peace, justice, integrated into this comprehensive program where you're taking classes, you're reflecting, you are doing internships out in the community. So he kind of sounds to you like he came to you with some kind of vague notion, and you molded it and shaped it into the Pulse program. I know we have some slides on it. I don't know if you want to take us through the slides or just
this would probably be a good time to start the slides.
Okay.
So as I said, his name was Joe Fitzpatrick. I think the Pulse program in Boston College owes him a great debt for coming up with the initial idea. My big change in it was to say that really the placements we ought to be dealing with were dealing with people who were on the margins of our society, people who were suffering racial discrimination or educational inadequacies or healthcare inadequacies. So that really became the focus of what we were going to do in terms of the quote unquote internships. So this began in 1970. Maybe we could take a look at the next slide. And people ask, what does the word Pulse stand for? This was 1970. It was the height of the anti-war movement. It was the height of the Vietnam War. The civil rights movement was very active. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated 2 years before. There was a lot of ferment. So we had this idea of the vitality of the movement of the time. And people ask us, what does Pulse stand for? We came up with the idea of Pulse having to do with this vitality of the social involvement and social change. And then we tried to make it stand for something. And we sat around trying to make different words fit into PULSE, and it got a little silly, so we just gave up. So
it sounds like, in a way, it stands for having your pulse on the heart of what was going on at that time, in a way. I mean, I know you don't have an exact acronym for it, but it's kind of like have our pulse on what needs to happen, what needs to change, kind of have it come up from within.
Yeah, that was how that dynamic image is how we came up with the word first. And then, as I said, we tried to make it stand for things, but it got a little ridiculous. So we just let it stand as what it is.
Okay. And so then you've got this graphic on the next slide, right? About it.
This became the model. So initially,
the slide before that, maybe.
Yeah, Joe Fitzpatrick wanted to just have academic credit awarded for involvement in internship types of programs. And as we'll see on a subsequent slide, the other person that was instrumental in the beginning of this program was a Jesuit who at the time was the chair of the philosophy department and became really one of my most important mentors. His name was Father Joseph Flanagan. And he came up with the idea that we should not do just academic credit for social involvement, but rather it should be an integration of service work, academic reflection, and classroom learning. So we have this great graphic that one of my friends crafted for us to show kind of how the gears of the Pulse program mesh with one another.
Well, so, I just want to add something there, just because that was my experience as an undergraduate, just to let our viewers know. I mean, I went through your course, The Person in Social Responsibility, and that was mind-blowing to me in terms of reading some of the great works, Aristotle, et cetera, In Search of Dibs, which was modern day. But it was very instrumental in terms of not just the readings, but then we had to keep a journal and we had to reflect on our readings and experiences and have a placement. I had a placement at Rosie's Place, which was a shelter for homeless women where I served meals and then did a couple of overnights there. And I have to say, because even though I grew up in an affluent town, but I mean, we were on food stamps at times, so I kind of had a little bit of a schizophrenic experience. But and while I was going through your course, my father lost his job and I had to pay for my college. So it was sort of like I lived in two worlds. But I remember very much talking to some of the residents at Rosie's Place, and it really challenged my beliefs, assumptions as to how somebody becomes homeless. People had PhDs, that were homeless. So it was really, really interesting in just living that experience from the inside out. So I just kind of wanted to, what would you say about, I mean, and you've now taken thousands of students through. I'm one person, but that was part of my formative years that profoundly shaped my experience at Boston College, my sense of belonging and my sense of social justice.
Well, that's certainly what the Pulse program has become for so many students. For your viewers, the basic structure is that our students in the Pulse program, and that's before this year. This year we've had to go online, remote service, which has been a challenge, but also been done remarkably well. But up until this past year, our students would spend about 8 hours a week, every single week, at a place like Rosie's Place, or like at a food hunger hotline, or tutoring and mentoring students, or teaching in high school equivalency diploma programs in juvenile or adult correctional facilities. So these are the kinds of things that people would do. In addition to those 8 hours of direct service weekly, they would be in class 4 hours a week. 3 of those hours would be lecture, conversational on academic material, like main books from the history of philosophy, such as the ones that had touched and inspired me as an undergraduate. But also in theology, religious studies. And then in addition, an hour a week in a small discussion group where students could talk about their experiences at their service placements, which had those mind-blowing experiences that you described.
Yeah.
They could write about those in journals and reflect on them, and I would give them individual feedback on their writings. And the remarkable thing was, and it took us really 5 years to figure out ways of doing this effectively. The remarkable,
Pat, I do want to add something because, as a sort of lost and searching college student, I distinctly remember your comments on some of my journal entry, because sometimes you're thinking, oh, it's an assignment, I just got to write something. But you had a sense of feeling like, oh, somebody's actually listening out there, And I personally found some of your comments on my journals so helpful.
Well, the approach that I took on the journals was inspired to some extent by the book that you mentioned, Virginia Axline, Dibs in Search of Self, but also by Carl Rogers. And I wasn't practicing therapy. I'm not trained to practice therapy, but what I discovered that was strength in that approach was the companioning. And mainly what I tried to do in my comments was simply to communicate that I was listening to what my students were writing.
That's so profound and important.
Occasionally, I would give a suggestion, or frequently I would ask a question to kind of push a person to dig more deeply into it. But what we discovered was our students would come to us and say, on the one hand, they were reading the same texts in philosophy and theology that their peers were reading in courses that didn't have the service component, and they were getting more out of that. They were discovering, in ancient texts, Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, and so on, that they were saying things that they needed to hear to help them think about the experiences they were having in their service. And on the other hand, by doing that, they found that they were able to be of greater value in their service because they were thinking beyond the immediate. You sent me a question about what this has to do with liberal education, and especially the Jesuit tradition in liberal education. I would say many things, but one would be that liberal education and general education kind of take the long view. Brian Stevenson recently, quoting Martin Luther King, who himself was quoting Theodore Parker, liked to say, "The arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice." And the major transformations that have happened that have brought about greater justice in our society are by people who took the long view, people who were willing to kind of roll up their sleeves and commit themselves to long, seemingly often fruitless, hopeless endeavors. And only by doing that did some of the great transformations come about. And I think that's what the Jesuit tradition of insisting on liberal arts at the heart of its education. Students can come to Boston College or any of the other great Jesuit colleges and universities and get professional skills. I went there to become a physicist, and I could have become a physicist. The guy who was 3 years ahead of me at Boston College, Ernie Monst, became the Secretary of Energy under President Obama after he got his PhD in physics from Stanford. So I could have done that. But the important thing for me, and I think Ernie would say something similar, is that the humanities education that we got there allowed us to think about what we were doing in a context of something greater than ourselves. And
well, I do remember as part of that program, I mean, I took several classes as part of that program, faith and identity, faith, work, and justice, the challenge of justice. So all these programs that I found to be interdisciplinary and very interesting, where like the challenge of justice, that one where we had to talk about, wrestle with some complex issues in the context of whatever our discipline was. I mean, my major happened to be English. And I remember we studied Northern Ireland. So it was, a real opportunity to study very complex societal issues and kind of grapple with moral and ethical dilemmas. So I'm curious, from your standpoint, as a scholar and a teacher, and you have such a body of work, even in terms of what you've published, what would you say today in terms of the best development for the next generation of leaders, and especially in the current context of, I think we have some crises of leadership in the world today.
Yeah, I agree. We do have crises of leadership. This is another question that you sent me, was what do I see as the prospects and the hopes for the time?
Yeah.
The last 2 years, and especially since the murder of George Floyd in the summer, has really kind of brought to the surface tensions in our society. We have tensions with regard to race, of course, but also tensions with regard to justice of income inequality and access to things like education, jobs, healthcare, and so on in our society. There's also tensions with regard to care for our planet. And it can seem almost hopeless now that we could ever do anything about that. But in some ways, it's similar to what it was like for me when I was an undergraduate. Among other things, in addition to the real desperateness of the civil rights struggle at that time, the anti-Vietnam War struggle at that time, hanging over our heads was not the prospect of environmental disaster, which was just barely beginning to become aware, even to scientists at that time, but nuclear war, nuclear annihilation, global nuclear annihilation. To be perfectly honest with you, I didn't think I would live to see the year 2000 because I was so sure that we would have a nuclear holocaust by then. But I think my involvement with my study of philosophy and also the personal contact that our students, people like you, have had, and putting those two things together is really what's been transformative. I think of the many students that we have who've graduated from the program who have been dramatically changed by the program. I think of someone like Jonathan Scott, who started out as a freshman volunteering at a halfway house for recovering alcoholics and went on to form a really remarkable cluster of agencies called Victory Programs in Massachusetts, which deals with many different issues having to do with homelessness, discrimination, and women suffering abuse, domestic abuse, and so on. He says that his involvement in the Pulse program led him to make that decision. He could have been something else. I think of people like a woman I met when I was a juror a number of years ago, who it turned out had been a Boston College student in the Pulse program, and she was working with children in schools who were having a hard time adjusting to being in a classroom. And so I asked her, does the Pulse program have anything to do with your career choice? And she said, absolutely. I completely changed what I wanted to do with my life. And for people who don't maybe change their careers, I think of people like you. I watch some of the programs that you have produced that focus on two gentlemen who are working to provide housing for homeless people, or a woman who's an art professor who works on art having to do with interracial relations.
Yeah.
And I see that happening with our students. Some go on to change their careers, but others don't change their careers, but they take what they learned into their walks of life.
Yes, no, absolutely. You have affected so many lives. The Pulse program has had such a profound impact. It's really the ripple effect. So thank you. We're already at time. I mean, there's so much we could talk about, but thank you so much for coming on. We might have to have you on again, if you would. But if anybody was interested in anything we talked about today, how would they reach you?
Well, the first thing is the Pulse website at Boston College. So that's www.bc.edu/pulse. Okay. And then if people wanted to contact me personally, it's just my last name, Byrne, @bc.edu.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Pat.
Thank you, Suze.
Absolutely.